I want to thank you last night, especially you, Yvonne, for keeping me awake for a good portion of the night yesterday, thinking about your question. I really do want to thank you for that. I believe, as a matter of leadership, I believe that we are all better when we push, challenge, encourage each other in our thinking. In fact, I often say in places where I've been a leader, and I say it now at Concordia College, that if the two of us are thinking the same thing, then one of us is not necessary. And I'm not the one, because I'm the president. So you better find something good to say to challenge me on this, or challenge us on this. And to kind of cultivate and curate an environment that invites feedback is one that I try to encourage in places where I work. And so I want to thank you, Yvonne, publicly for, actually when I went back thinking last night, what I was thinking about was, why did I resist saying what was on my mind as you were asking the question about content? And so I thought that through. And I resisted saying, so your question was, what is the definition of evil? And what I wanted to say was something like, it's contextual. It varies from situation and time and place and relationship. And so that was what I wanted to say. And then I had this other side of my brain that said, if you say that, you sound like a situation ethicist. Right? Joseph Fletcher, right? You sound like someone who's like a postmodern, anything goes, it's your thing, do what you want to do. That's a song by the Isley Brothers, right? Right? And that's, of course, not good ethics. And so that's the battle I sort of had. And so I was thinking that through last night, and I think this is the tentative conclusion that I've come to. And all of these sorts of conclusions are always tentative, I think. So the tentative conclusion is that there is absolute truth. There is absolutely absolute truth. But humans aren't very good with it, or at figuring it out. And I think that's my hesitation, is that humans have... There's a paradoxical character in this life, on this side of eternity. There's a sort of paradoxical character to all of life that kind of is riven through all of life. And so it seems like the instant we think we've got it figured out, and we must judge. We got to make judgments. In life, you got to make judgments, right? Mrs. Nudis and I have 6 children. 87% are female. So we had like 5 teenage girls, basically, 19 to 13, in the house at the same time. So like being a college president is easy, right? And so, but I made a lot of judgments, as the father in the house. You got to make judgments. You also got to know, and Jesus helps us to know this, that with whatever judgment you make, it might be that scaffolding on which you hang and sway, right? That's the meaning of Matthew 7. It doesn't mean don't judge. It means just be aware of the fact that every time you make a kind of critical evaluation, it's that same thing that's coming right back at you, right? So just kind of, so there's a humility then that goes with all of these sort of judgments, always. So there's a kind of caution that goes with all of it when we think we've got it figured out. And so I think that was part of my hesitation. And then I was thinking, is there a story I could use to illustrate that? And so this story arose, and I don't have his permission to tell this story because he would never grant permission to tell a story like this about him. So I actually want to tell the cameras to turn off. Hi, pleased to join you again. We're here live. So, Alexander Solzhenitsyn once said, something like this. Okay, so Gulag Archipelago, right? Face to face with some of the worst evil. And he said something that has struck me, is that the line between good and evil does not run between you and me. Like you're evil and I'm not, which is easy and convenient. But it runs, yeah, right, exactly, you know it. It runs through every human heart. Now, if he could say that after what he endured, there's something there about that. So, I hesitate with but I thank you for and what actually kept me awake was when I said, too many times we've called something evil and learned later that it actually, and then you said, muttering under your breath back there, I heard you, you said, Yvonne, too many times we've not called it out and wish we had in retrospect. But in both cases, there's humility that goes with all of these attributions or assignments of evil. So thanks for that push. Oh yeah, and the other thing I wanted to say is I think the best thing to do in the face of this is to engage, and this is what we must do. As a nation, as a church, we should be taking the lead. Our nation is obviously quite divided. More than ever, right? So it behooves all of us now to identify people, colleagues, people in our circle who have different worldviews than we, who are not like us, and to seek them out and to sit down with them. So I've got a guy named Peter. That's actually his real name. And I disagree with him on like a whole matter of stuff, okay? He's a really smart guy. And we sit down, and Peter helps me to understand like this whole Joe Plumber NASCAR cultural phenomenon. I don't get it, okay? Those are not my peeps or whatever they are, right? The NASCAR people, right? Vroom, 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 okay? Vroom, right? F-350. Those are not my people, okay? I don't know these people. And he helps me he gives me another side of that. So the easy thing to do is say, well, they're obviously evil, right? And I'm not. And I think the more responsible, our baptisms call us into community and relationship. And so we actually sit down. We used to actually meet at my house until my wife said, you can't meet here anymore because you get too loud. And so we now go like in the woods or someplace, way off where the NASCAR people live out. No, I'm joking. Okay. So thanks for that little excursus on these dividing lines. And I do think it behooves us all, though, really to kind of... So I actually, when Peter and I talk, we talk about immigration a lot. I'm an immigrant. I'm a double immigrant. Thanks for letting me in. Hope I haven't messed it up too much. All right. I wasn't born here, born in Jamaica, right? Raised in Canada, so I'm a double immigrant. And a lot of his people, they don't like immigrants. So we spend a lot of time, in these kind of conversations, across a table, in dialogue, trying to understand each other's trajectories of history. Because we have completely different trajectories of what way things are going as a nation. Okay, so we're doing a Bible study here tonight. So let's see, God's Word loaded with the language of paradox. We got that, that's our theme. This is how my wife and I, Monique, is here. This is how we spent the first 3 hours of 2016. We rode on the Lutheran Hour Ministries float in the Tournament of Roses parade. It was awesome. 1 million people on the parade route. 900 and something thousand people, more people than I'd ever seen in my life on the parade in such a short amount of time. And there we were, and there was Jesus. You see Jesus? He's here. He's dressed in white, and he is white. And he's here and he's waving, and he's smiling, and he's very, very happy. And we were waving, and we were waving, and we were waving, and we waved some more. And if I hear in the next 100 years of my life, Irv, shine, Jesus, shine. If I hear it one more time, because it played like a tape loop on our float, right? Fill the land with I can tell you every word of every verse, of every chorus, of every refrain. And so I learned some things that day on a parade route. For example, do not drink liquids prior to... I learned that, okay? I learned a couple other things, more practical. Here's something I learned, how popular Jesus still is. Jesus is incredibly... So the nuns are rising, we heard that this morning, in terms of people who are non-affiliated or non-church affiliated, but Jesus is still very, very popular. Like there were only a few boos and hisses, and there was just a little bit of mockery, but 1 million people? And there was people were happy about Jesus, and they were happy in different ways. I learned how different, you can almost pick out their kind of religious denominational background, The Pentecostals are the most excited about Jesus, of course. Hallelujah, yeah! Both hands up raised. I like that. And half of the parade route, by the way, another thing I learned, is Latino, which they don't show you on, Home and Garden TV, okay? Half of the parade route out in the neighborhoods. As soon as you get past the big turn, which is I think exactly where that is, that's like showtime, As soon as you get back, all the neighborhoods, you have families, multi-generations of Latinos, all along with their minivan, and the seat in the minivan is out, and they have a barbecue pit set up, and the whole family out, It was amazing. Jesus, great love for Jesus. Great love for Jesus. The United States in 1960 was 85% white, Lutherans. And in 2060 will be 43% white. And it's already there in places like LA and in places like the school of which I'm president, Concordia College. Our largest minority group are white people. They're 33% of our student body. And then everything else after that, all kinds of everything after that. But you see that. And Jesus is popular among all different kinds of people. There were some African Americans who weren't happy about the whiteness of Jesus, and they made that known, So that was kind of awkward for Monique and for me. We were kind of like, and to be honest, I'll confess this. I'm among, people who hear confession, right? We did throw Jesus under a couple times. A couple times we went, well, I don't know why they got him, okay? Because people were like, really? A white Jesus? Really? So it's kind of interesting. Isn't it interesting how we all see Jesus in our own sort of way, too? Isn't it interesting how Jesus is popular, but that church is still so divided in all the ways in which it was? And so we had this interesting little macrocosm of America here along this parade route. And so we've got some disruptive work to do, especially we as Lutherans. More white, more English speaking than any religious tradition in North America. Pew Foundation, City College of New York American Religious Identification Survey in 2002, and Pew Foundation in 2015. Google it. More white and more English speaking than Mormons. That takes work. Okay, they're from Utah, okay? They had laws restricting minority involvement as a full membership. So we've got some creative, disruptive work to do. And I think it's groups like this that actually get that work done. Is Carlos here? I thought I saw Carlos Hernandez here. Yeah, he was here when it was time to eat. Okay, all right, so, okay. Tell him I missed him. I'm sorry I missed him. Okay. So we got work to do. Creative disruption. Not just disruption, but there's the paradox, right? Creative disruption, which is, I believe, the work of Jesus. The turning point in Mark's gospel of Jesus' life is Mark chapter 8, verses 27 through 30. And in that frame, Jesus asks a question. Who do the crowds along the parade route at the Tournament of Roses parade say I am? Who do they say I am? Oh, they think you're John the Baptist with your head reattached. Okay. Or was it cut off by then? I don't know. Yeah. Elijah? Some prophetic apparition from some theophanic kind of manifestation of incarnation of an Old Testament prophet come back to life. And then, of course, Jesus puts the second question, but you, who do you say I am? Which is really interesting, right? They have all these ideas about Jesus. And I believe Jesus is the great disruptor. I'm not the only one who said that, of course. Who else said that? Anyone else? No? What literary figure? Wasn't it one of the Russian authors, the great disruptor? Yeah, okay. It's Dostoevsky maybe, or one of those. Yeah, sure, okay. We'll just pretend like that's right, and then no one else knows. So, oh yes, of course, Dostoevsky, yeah. So the great disruptor is Jesus. He overturns the colonial imperial ambitions of the Roman Empire. He overturns the religious traditionalism. Not traditions. Traditions are a good thing. Pelican taught us well. Tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. Okay, he overturns, disrupts the traditionalisms of Pharisaical and scribal and Sadducean religion and religiosities and petty pieties. He overturns the messianic Jesus Christ superstar ambitions of his followers, right? Who wanted him to be this one who restores, who makes Israel great again. I didn't mean that, okay. Okay. But it's true. Yeah, that's what he wanted, right? That's what they kind of wanted. You know, to restore the fortunes in that sort of way. So Jesus is kind of a disruptor here of everything. Who do you say I am? And the Son of Man began teaching them that he must undergo great suffering, not a popular way to kind of start. And so this is the turning point of Mark's gospel. The theme of Mark, as we said yesterday, is that things are going to get worse before they get better. You know, not a great way to start a popular movement. Say, hey, follow me and die. Die to self, you know, and die to martyrdom, the death of a witness. Undergo great suffering. So in the face of all that we face, in the face of all that we as disruptors face, I like what Timothy George at Beeson in Alabama says, and he cites St. Augustine, the North African church father. He says, there are two major and regrettably common mistakes Augustine wants us to avoid. Now think paradox again. So sometimes you know, the kind of paradox is avoiding these two kind of poles, disparate poles. The one is the lure of utopianism. This is the mistake of thinking that we can produce a human society that will solve our problems and bring about the kingdom of God on earth. This was the basic error of Marxism and 19th century liberalism. So, utopianism on the one hand. Who can guess what's on the other hand? That's one hand. What's the other hand? Yeah, well, radical orthodoxy or hyper-orthodoxy. What'd you say? Dystopianism. Nice. That's a great word. Dystopic literature is dystopic movies, exactly. The kind of Armageddon themes. Dystopianism. The other error, equally disastrous, is cynicism. This creeps up on us as we see ever-present evil. We withdraw into our own self-contained circle of contentment, which can just as well be a pious holy huddle as a secular skeptics club. So we retreat and we talk about the world, the culture, all that evil stuff out there that's like pressing up against us, as if we're not like a part of that or have had a part in producing that. Okay, so that's the error of cynicism. So the tendency of some more moderate Christians is towards the utopianism, and the tendency to some more conservative Christians is towards the cynicism. So this is why I'm arguing for this paradoxical approach in response. And I think that, you know, we talk about Lutheran accents. But I think there's actually a downside to one of the Lutheran accents. And I hinted at it yesterday when I asked, are good works necessary? Yes, right? But not for salvation, yeah. But you know, you talk to some Lutherans and they go right to like, we're saved by grace through faith, not of. So what do you got to do? Nothing! In fact, that's why I joined the Lutheran church. All those other churches had all these rules and stuff you had to do. But hey, it's Lutheran. You can do whatever you want to do. Well, that's not kind of what that means, right? Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9 is followed by verse 10, exactly. For you are God's workmanship. And you peel back the word workmanship in English and you get to the word beneath that. It's a beautiful Greek word, poema, which sounds like poem. You are God's poem. God is the poet. Created in Christ Jesus, has God written you into the world, into the drama of this life, to do good works. There it is. So yeah, humans cannot be justified before God by their own powers, merits, or works. Augustana 4 is very, very clear. But good work, so God doesn't need our good works. But our sisters and our brothers do. Exactly. Okay. So let's see. So Jesus speaks to them in parables. And here's one of his parables in Mark. Jesus also said, the kingdom of God is as if someone would scatter seed. That's a work. The work of scattering seed. As if someone would scatter seed on the ground and would sleep and rise night and day. Sleeping isn't much of a work, by the way. So now we're already creeping into this like not working very much here. And the seed itself would sprout and grow. He does not know how. The earth produces of itself. That's a kind of cool phrase in Greek. Automatically is actually the phrase. Automate, right? So it's not like by our works that this kingdom happens. This kingdom of God, yes, we are scatterers and we are workers, and the harvest is plentiful and the workers are few, and we are workers and we are among the workers, but the earth produces of itself. First the stalk, then the head, then the full grain of head. Okay, so Jesus goes on to say in Mark 13, as for yourselves, beware, for they will hand you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings because of me as a testimony to them. So I want to talk a little bit about an overlooked saint in our Lutheran sphere. So there are actually more Lutherans alive, like right now, than there have ever been in the history of the world. So Lutherans are growing, right? It's about 70 million in 1900, and then it was a slow dip through the 20th century, and then around the 60s, 70s, 80s, the number starts to rise again, and now it's like about 74 million Lutherans in the world. So more than there have ever been in the history of the world. Thing is that the average, so you're talking about Lutheran accents, they've changed, right? So the average Lutheran now looks like an East African, a Tanzanian, an Ethiopian. And this man, Gudina Tumsa. Has anybody ever heard of this name? Okay, everybody say that with me. Ready? Gudina Tumsa. Okay, I want you to remember this name. Our confessions say that the saints should be kept in remembrance among us so that we may see their good works and emulate them. Glorify our Father in heaven and emulate them. And this is one worth emulation. Okay? Talking about being handed over to councils and beaten. Okay? So Gudina Tumsa was born in 1929, and he was martyred, a witness for the faith, on July 28, 1979. He actually spent a lot of time studying in the United States. He was kind of like the Ethiopian Bonhoeffer, people called him. Okay? Call him. So he was born in Ethiopia, Oromo, of the Oromo people, moved to the United States for his education, actually went to Luther Seminary in St. Paul for a number of years, and then could have stayed but returned to Ethiopia and gave leadership in the Makane Jesus church there. And he actually became the president or the secretary general of the church body in the late 70s. And he was, by the Marxist government, arrested because this upstart religious movement, sounds like New Testament stuff, this upstart religious movement refused to preach the tenets of the state. Like they were belligerent in their refusal. And so they beat, Jesus says, you will be beat. Okay? They beat Tumsa, tortured him, and then released him. And they thought they had taught him a lesson. And when he was released, he got out and he said, well, if it's that important to the Marxist government that we not preach the gospel, then it behooves us, exactly, you may as well just be up here, buddy, yeah. Then it behooves us to, I'm glad you're up here in my amen corner. It behooves us to preach it even more, that the word is not bound. So he actually instructed his pastors to let it go, let it fly unfettered now. This gospel of Jesus. And so he said, the gospel of Jesus Christ, he said, that saves us, he says, from sin, death, the devil, malaria, poverty. He went down to the whole list. That's a kind of holistic gospel, right? And so when they heard that he was doing that, they arrested him again. And they, this time, killed him and buried his body in the imperial grounds. And they thought that they had killed the movement, this upstart movement. But Tertullian warned us that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And you can't kill this thing. They tried that once, didn't they? Didn't they try to kill like the leader of this thing? It didn't work out too well, right? So you don't get to kill this thing, right? And so here's what Toomsa says about what we do in the face of evil. He says, we as Christians cannot tolerate a bad situation and keep quiet. It is our duty to act. Everybody say act. That's to do something. To speak. And even risk our life. Okay, so this is what witnesses do. A little bit of the history of Mekane Jesus. It was founded in 1959. This church body with 65,000 members. It was founded as a merger of some smaller mission societies. At its 40th anniversary, it had 2.5 million members. At its 50th anniversary, 5.1 million members. And nowadays, it's about 6.5 million members. Okay. So, I don't know. I think we can learn from Alberto Garcia, and I have just written a book called Reimagining the Reformation from the Margins. And we're looking at Latin America and African-American kind of cultural settings and the Christian faith in those settings. And what we're positing is that we, and I include myself, can learn from the church around the world, more than we probably think we can learn. And I believe that the Ethiopian church is one of those churches from which we can learn. Yes.
Are you saying that those churches in South America and Africa are in the margins?
Yes.
Because
well, then they're
at the same time we're becoming marginalized here. Because of our inability to speak, our unwillingness to speak and to act.
That'd be a great conversation to discuss the relative marginalization of Christianity in North America. I think different people would have different responses to that. Yeah, that would be a great table talk. You want to do one?
Up to you.
We can, yeah. John, you want to say something? Did you have your hand up? Okay. All right. This is one of their churches here. So, it's interesting. H. George Anderson once said this. A seminarian at Concordia Seminary, St. Louis. He was speaking at Concordia Seminary, St. Louis at a symposium. And a seminarian said, similar to you, what's going to happen when the church in North America is at the margins of society? It gets kicked out of the center, which I don't believe it is. I mean, we talk about persecution, and it's really like we've lost our tax-exempt status. That's not persecution. Okay, so I don't think we're marginalized. I mean, but I mean, we could. That's a good argument. I mean, we could argue about that, but maybe that's what'll keep me awake tonight. But
I'm not even saying that that there's an organized effort or a disorganized effort on anyone else's part to margin, but that we marginalize ourselves.
Oh, we marginalize ourselves. Yeah, sure.
When we refuse to speak.
Yeah, well, listen to what Bishop Anderson said. He said, so the seminarian said, what happens when the church gets pushed to the edge of society, or, that's kind of where it finds itself. And Bishop Anderson said this, well, two things will happen. In the first place, it'll be back where it belonged, because it never belonged in the center of power. So Constantine and the Constantinian compromise is what he's kind of pointing to. Jesus didn't find himself there at all. This disruptor, right? The second thing he said will break your brain. He said this. He said, anyway, he said, nonetheless, it is the case that attributions of marginality depend on our assumptions about the center. So what you presume to be at the center determines then what you call the margins, right? So back to Bonhoeffer, if Christ is the center, then whoever is near Christ is at the center, right? So I don't know. I mean, the center of what? The center of what power? Yeah.
I believe it was.
You're not done. Okay. I thought I had backed you down with that riddle. Okay.
Well, back to Bonhoeffer.
Yes, Jim.
He also wrote that the Germans at the time of Nazism were like greenhouse Christians.
Greenhouse Christians.
And I grew up in the greenhouse business. I was in that up until 13 years ago, and I know exactly what he meant because
What did he mean?
Bonhoeffer's time, all greenhouses were glass houses.
Ah.
The glass houses didn't allow a certain ray of light in, and so plants that were brought out of it had to be gently brought out. And the atmosphere of the time, those Christians were tender Christians grown in an ideal situation in which they were then brought out and exposed to an atmosphere in an ungentle way.
That's very, very good. Thank you, Jim. Yvonne pointed to that today about Bonhoeffer spending time at Abyssinian Baptist in New York, which is one of the places that Monique and I actually like to go to church. That's a fabulous church. To this day, it's a fabulous church in Harlem. And there he saw a different sort of, the opposite of the antithesis of a greenhouse kind of faith. Right. Okay, so I want to kind of introduce this notion of creative disruption now that I've been kind of pointing at. Okay. So I think one of the things that afflicts the church in the West, one of the things we can learn not only from Christians on the margins, but also from the Gospel of Mark. Because remember, the Gospel of Mark is written at a time of, it's apocalyptic times, right? I mean, society, the wheels are coming off, the hinges are coming off the doors, the wheels are coming off. I mean, that's why it's so fast moving, because Mark's got a message that he needs to get out. And so it feels a lot like a time of chaos. And I think we, in the West especially, with our kind of hyper-organizational kind of ethos, right, have a particular aversion to, chaos, Like even when you look at 1 Corinthians, that verse about let all things be done decently and in good order, like everything around that is about like speaking in tongues and spiritual gifts and everything else. But we picked that, we love that one verse, everything be decently and in good order, okay? So that's fine. So chaos. So I think our go-to tends to be complacency, which is what you were pointing at earlier with your kind of greenhouse effect. A kind of complacency, okay? So not speaking, not acting, not risking. And this notion of creative disruption goes like this, that we're trying to find a zone that doesn't drive a system into chaos, because nothing gets done when people are it's like amygdala hijack, right? Sets in, and nothing gets done when you're in chaos. But when you're in this kind of zone, I want to call it, of creative disruption, it's both creative and it's disruptive. And that's actually where stuff happens. So just quickly, business and industry have that sense. So for example, I understand that some of you had an experience today. Is that right? Didn't you mention? Yes, exactly. Thumbs up. Anheuser-Busch. Okay. And Anheuser-Busch has just created a new position in their corporation called Chief Officer for Disruptive Growth. Because they sort of realize that these microbreweries are eating their lunch or drinking their beer or whatever it is, right? Are kind of working in from the outside. So they have to disrupt kind of their... And there's actually some analogies. Anheuser-Busch is an old, trusted label. So is Lutheran, right? Anheuser-Busch had a way of doing business. So do Lutherans tend to have a way of doing business, okay? So there's we're kind of having our lunch eaten around the edges, Look at the demographic trend. As white and as English-speaking as we are as Lutherans, that's not our biggest demographic challenge. So I am 20 years older than the average American. The average American's 33, I'm 53. I'm still 1 year younger than the average Lutheran. So I'm still like youth, right? So that's actually our biggest demographic, but it's not unrelated to the other demographic challenge. in terms of white and English speaking because of who has babies. So I want to just kind of go through a list, and then we'll have a table talk of kind of some elements of creative disruption. These are descriptive elements. And probably people like Yvonne want like definitions. But I'm going to give you some kind of descriptive elements. It is mission-focused, not self-indulgent. Mission-focused, not self-indulgent. It is surgical, not random. It is scalpel-like, not sledgehammer, just like tearing it all apart and saying you're a disruptor. It is managed, not untended. Careful, not reckless. Prayerful, because it rhymes with careful, not self-sufficient. Systemic, not atomistic. It is pruning, not cutting. It is generative, not destructive. It is oxygenizing, which is actually a word, oxygenizing, not suffocating. It is life-giving, not death-dealing. It is patient, not instantaneous. So why don't we have a few minutes at our tables, okay, table talk, and let's talk a little bit about these kind of elements of creative disruption, how we see them show up in the places where we work, how we can be agents of a kind of creative disruption for the sake of the mission, for the sake of the greater good in the places that we find ourselves. Okay, let's take 5 minutes at our tables, please. The question of multi-ethnicity, for example, and are not reflecting, the kind of society. I think if we're not intentional, it won't happen. So I'm not talking about quotas. ELCA tried quotas for 25 years, and it didn't make any difference in terms of the ethnic composition of the ELCA. Okay, so it's much more than quotas that I'm talking about. I'm talking about an intentionality that goes to actually disrupting some of the systems that we have to allow other people kind of room at the table. Because I always say, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. So, I mean, there's a truth to that, right? And so a corollary to that is nothing about them without them. Like, we don't sit here and plan ministry for another group, okay? So there is an intentionality to all of that. And so the reversion is always to the way we've kind of always sort of done things. So to be creatively disruptive means to be beyond that complacency, and no, not to drive a system into chaos, but to be intentional. So the multi-ethnicity was just one illustration.
So as you look at Jesus doing this,
yeah.
everything he did was very intentional.
Oh, my gosh, yeah. From the time he set his face toward Jerusalem, I mean, this is a man on a mission, and yeah, I would say yes. There's an intentionality about the woman who touched him. She was not the first to touch him, and he felt the power go out of him. There's an intentionality at each. That's very good. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, others. Yes, sir. And your name is? Emmanuel. With us, God.
So with the Lutheran urban kingdom expansion, they actually put their own kind of leaders in the four churches it's a part, but those leaders to put out a new vision, a new kind of energy. But then those people are still called by the same churches that kind of so they're still working together. They didn't just impose a new leadership. They just basically got them.
Oh, you're doing a critique of the ELCA?
No, it's the Look. Isn't that the Look is a LCMS program? So that's what they're doing. They put new leaders in the four churches, new pastors, but they're not the head pastor. They just basically to put new energy.
Oh, I see. They're not in positions of decision making.
Well, they are now kind of putting new energy into the church and kind of
putting new energy, but not making any decisions.
The congregation.
I'm obviously trying to fish something out of you. That matters to me. Yeah.
Yeah, the congregation still chose them basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there is something around the power dynamics that matter in terms of the intentionality of how that works as well. Exactly. Exactly. And how decisions are made. So that's one of the questions you ask a group. How do you make decisions? How do you arrive at decisions? And who gets to make them? And decisions are usually, how is the money spent? How are the resources deployed? How is the building used? Who gets to use it and when? So it is all of those kind of questions and intentionality around all those sorts of questions. Correct.
As I look at this, what I think of is just the relational aspect.
Yeah.
The relationship is so important. And I think even of my time in ministry as a chaplain in hospice, where some of this, the creative disruption, the things that maybe I'm able to, maybe push people on, ask some courageous questions, it all is based upon that relationship and that trust. And so I really see that not just in one-on-one, but also in the church life too. And that relational aspect, that's where I think as we build those relationships with people, those opportunities to really, I think, put some of these creative disruptions out there.
Chad, thanks for that. Now hang on to that thought. Later on I'm going to talk about how Bonhoeffer understood the image of God.
One story that struck me was one of the members who was in prison. They forced him out of prison because he was converting too many people. And then his story, that was a wonderful story, but to follow it up, he said, many of those who were torturing us in those positions of authority at that time have now become Christians through the witness of that church.
Wow.
So it's really quite amazing.
Yeah, that is. Okay.
The disruptors.
Disruptors. Okay. And notice it's a paradox. It's creative and it's disruption. Okay, so it means there's a change that's happening here. This is St. Peter's Lutheran Church, located, this former building, at 53rd and Lexington Avenue in Manhattan on the east side. And it was a church that was stately in its Victorian grandeur. And it was impossible in the wintertime to heat and in the summertime to cool. And it was entirely impractical and falling apart. But it was stately and beautiful in its grandeur. Can you imagine that meeting around the table on that day when that one church leader came in and said, hey, I've got an idea. Let's tear this down and sell the airspace. Which is what they did. They sold it to the Citicorp, and it's now the Citicorp Bank Tower there. At the base of the bank tower is this new St. Peter's Lutheran Church. Entirely heatable and coolable and affordable and practical and usable. And in fact, it's used every day. It's used for theater, it's used for drama. They have the best jazz liturgy in the world. I mean, 4:30 on Sunday afternoons, go to St. Peter's. Phenomenal jazz vespers at St. Peter's. In fact, it's the jazz cathedral of New York. It's the place where all the jazz musicians, when they come to die, have their funerals. In fact, the best jazz album ever is this one here, just for your information. This is a fact that I'm giving you now. Okay? This is a truth that is absolute. Kind of Blue by Miles Davis. And Miles Davis had his funeral at St. Peter's Lutheran Church. And at his funeral, there spoke a keyboardist by the name of Herbie Hancock. And he said, I remember when I was like 20, 21 years old. This is at St. Peter's Lutheran Church. He said, I was playing in the Miles Davis Quintet, and I was so excited. And I got caught up in a song called So What? Ba-dum-ba-bum-ba-ba-bum-bum, da-da, ba-do-do-do-do-do-do, da-da. And he said, I lost my place in the chords, like where I was in the chords. And Miles Davis was so gifted, he bent the lead note so that I didn't sound stupid. Then he said, I wonder who was accompanying whom? So I think the relationships that creative disruption sort of implies, infer, and create would be those where there are relationships of this notion of accompaniment. Okay? And so I want to talk about this for a little bit. It's all about a four-letter preposition. This is the preposition of ministry. With. Not for, not to, not at. Although sometimes it's for, to, and at. Of course it is. But it is with. So with, right? Witness as our witness. Has anybody ever heard that phrase before? I think my campus chaplain created it. And I'm just checking it. So now in the next room I say that in, I'm going to say, as Josh Holman has said, because I think he made that up, witness as witness. It's like, think road to Emmaus. Think Jesus with the disciples on the road to Emmaus. Think accompaniment, and the accompaniment that goes with creative disruption. Luther kind of says this, where he says in his Two Kinds of Righteousness. What a fabulous treatise this is. Two kinds of righteousness, right? Righteousness before God, coram Deo. And righteousness before others, coram hominibus. So in the two kinds of righteousness, he says, we should not boast or get puffed up, nor should we despise or triumph over. That's not the preposition of choice, over, our neighbors, as if we were their God or equal to God. So now I want to talk about this notion of imago Dei, because that keeps on coming up. So is the imago Dei, the image of God, is it lost at the fall? Good evening, Dr. Hernandez. We were awaiting you to answer this question. Why am I here? That's great. That is one of the fundamental questions of life, isn't it? Why am I even here? Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. So that's why you're here late. Oh, okay. All right. So, is the image of God lost at the fall? I mean, I read in that little blue Elsie Messing Caridian Catechism, it says yes. And I think it's true. The image of God with respect to two kinds of righteousness. Ready? Two kinds of righteousness. The image of God with respect to righteousness is entirely lost at the fall. Of course it is. There's nothing we have in us. Nothing in my hand I simply to the cross I, okay, naked, come to thee for rest, right? So yeah, it's gone, okay? But with respect to other humans, coram hominibus, and the horizontal plane, the image of God is not lost at the fall, because in Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, it says, don't kill other people because they're created in the... Now, if it's gone, then you can kill them. So I actually think that little blue catechism, my CPH friends, needs to be edited and amended. I'll just say that up front. I really do think it does. I think it only gives half of the truth of the answer. Because it says that the image of God is lost at the fall. Yes, that's half true. With respect to righteousness, it is. But it has implications in our ministry if we say it's like just gone and non-Christians don't possess the image of God. That has implications in terms of how we treat the other and our neighbor. So, okay, I got that out. So let's go image of God. Okay, so Bonhoeffer has this whole thing he does with image of God. Now, Bonhoeffer's living in a time, where the image of God is under attack. And so there's two ways we understand the image of God. First, he said there's the analogy of being. Does anybody know what that is? What is that? The analogy of being. Yes, sir.
You look at the things of creation, you extrapolate from them the invisible nature of God.
Exactly. You extrapolate from this great big God who is omni everything. Omni, holy free. Okay, yeah. Omnipresent. And we have a little bit of presence. Some of us littler than others, right? But
we have goodness, but human goodness to the nth degree is
it's
divine.
not exactly. Okay, so you extrapolate from this big God, this little stuff. And that's usually the way we talk about the image of God, is the analogy of being, or the analogia entis. Bonhoeffer, in his footnote to his Genesis commentary, chapter 1, verse 26, says the image of God is also the analogy of relationship. In the same way that God is Father, Son, Spirit, parachoretically, interpenetratingly, right? Is Father, Son, is love, lover, beloved. So we find the image of God in community with others. It's kind of like that African proverb, I am because We are. So I think he's on to something there, that the image of God is lived out relationally. It's only kind of, and isn't it sort of true in terms of your vocation? You don't kind of ever realize your vocation until a church comes along and says, hey, you ought to be a pastor. And then you go to seminary and then someone else says, you ought to stick with it. Don't give up. And then finally you get a document and it says a whole group of people have said now you're a pastor. And then, so isn't it the vocation there's a truth to that. Our identity, who do people say I am? Okay, this is a different sort of question than Jesus is answering, but very similar in this sort of echoes. Okay, our identity is sort of formed in community. An image of God is known in community. This has implications for how we treat people. My grandmother was right. She said, John, well, it's nice to be important. It's more important to be nice. She was right about that. It's more important how we treat people. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. How we treat other humans. So there is something around. Someone John Foley, Emma Graber Porter, contends that the image of God can only be experienced if other people around you acknowledge it in you, which is kind of interesting. I think that's kind of tipping a little bit over on the relationist side, but I think she's on to something with that statement. You think no? No. It's a woman we both know, Emma Graber Porter. And I have her permission to say her name, so you can keep the camera rolling. Okay, so let's do some table talk around this distinction. Relationship, analogy of being, how does that shift? How is that disruptive? How does that shift your sort of understand? How is it created? How does that kind of shift the way we think of community and life together? Okay, let's spend 5 minutes at our tables, please. Thanks. And then I have a closing story and then one big point at the end and then we're done.
Can you be in a righteous relationship with God or bear God's image if you will not be in relationship with your neighbor?
How can you love this God who you have not seen while you...
Or if you will not forgive that person.
Yeah, I know. You forgave me once. Remember when you forgave me?
Many times.
Yeah, that was, yeah. Yeah, I only remember one, yeah. It was a pretty big one. It was a really, really big one. It was a really big one. Yeah, it was a huge one, yeah. And John forgave me, yeah. Yeah, I don't know, I think you're right. I don't think you can kind of, that's a self-aware question. That's a, what do you call it? Self-evident question. The answer's right in the question itself. Yeah, you cannot, exactly. Okay, I just want to finish up in terms of a story of creative disruption in the city of Valparaiso, Indiana. Last year, in the month of August, it was a balmy, sweltering August day, high noon, in the middle of the day, and a basketball player who happened to be African American from Valparaiso's team, and another person in the car and a third woman who was sitting in the back seat were, we don't know exactly what happened. We do know that there were police involved and that the officers were from a neighboring town. They weren't actually from Valparaiso. They're from a town that has 4 police officers. And this was one of their 4 police officers who had roamed over into Valparaiso and was going to make a big drug bust, he was sure. He was positive that this was they were doing a drug deal. And again, we don't know exactly what happened, but by the time the event escalated, there was arrests that were made, there was a scuffle, there was a tangle. There were not shots fired, but there could have been. Guns were pulled, dogs were produced. It was just a really ugly, ugly, ugly scene in Valparaiso. The charges were dropped a day later, but the community was in an uproar on 2 sides. The Fraternal Order of Police, does anybody know what that group is? It's like a union on steroids. Wow. Fraternal Order of Police, they were ready. They were ready and angry. I mean angry. And local activists were also angry and ready to march on City Hall. And a colleague and I, his name is Heath Carter, he's at Vanderbilt. Yvonne, are you at Vanderbilt? Yes. Find Heath Carter there. He's on a one-year, he's a historian of Christianity. And historians have a great, he's a civil rights historian. And historians have a great sense of, where this thing is heading. And we kind of figured out this thing was not heading for a good ending, okay? And Heath and I, Heath's he's a Christian, and we said, let's see what we can do to disrupt this whole process. And we know how it's going to play out. You St. Louisans know how it played out, okay? Okay? And so we knew how it was going to, it's predictable. The nation we live in, we know how this is going to play out. So we're like, let's do something creative and disruptive. So I actually remember that 2 years before the incident, a guy named David Reynolds was running for sheriff, county sheriff. And he strolled by my house, and he said, hey, can I put a sign up on your lawn? It's like on a major thoroughfare, big house, kind of saw the... I said, sure, go ahead, go for it, whatever. He said, listen, hey, anything I can do for you, just let me know, okay? Anything I can do for you, thanks. Just remember me, okay? Gave me his card, said, I'm your guy, okay? So I said, I remember a guy who was running for county sheriff. Let me give him a call and see if we can have a conversation. I called him, he actually remembered me. And Heath Carter said, I know these social activists. I'm going to ask them not to march, just to wait. I'm going to ask them just to wait. So we decided we'd do something different. We decided, let's get the officer who made the initial arrest and the person who was the most, I think, victimized by the whole thing, a guy named Daryl Jackson. Let's see if we can get them together face to face. And let's have, there's this old form of communication called a conversation. Okay? Yeah. Conversation, right? A civil conversation. As human beings. So we got them together, and Daryl Jackson, who is our guy from Valparaiso University, he was not the basketball player. The basketball player was also in the car, but he was a manager for the team and a graduate of Valpo. We asked him, what went wrong? Because the officer says that when you approached the car, that you didn't behave the way he needed you to behave. And Daryl said, I felt disrespected by the police officer by the way he approached me. So we said, okay. And we went over to the police officer. We said, so what happened? You kind of approached this car, and you seemed kind of angry. And the police officer said, I felt totally disrespected by Daryl Jackson. Now, we have PhDs, so we said there's a pattern forming here. Disrespected. So we went back over to Daryl, and we said, so what was underneath? Tell us about that disrespect. I mean, how did that affect you? He said, I was terrified. But as soon as I saw the police officer pull up, lights go on and everything else, I didn't know what, and I've seen all this stuff on the news, I didn't know what was happening, and I was terrified. I don't even remember what I said. I don't even remember what I said when I saw the cop. All I know is that I just froze. We went back over to the cop, and we said, so what's going on when Daryl reacted this way? What was going on with you? He said, have you seen the number of cops that are getting shot these days? I was terrified. Pattern emerging, okay? Which is the ground for a conversation. So we got everybody together. Let me tell you how it turned out at the end. Well, it turned out like this. This is Daryl. This is Sheriff Reynolds. This is John Costas, the mayor of... This actual story made national news, actually. Maybe some people have heard this story. Because it was a story that had an ending that was not like the endings that have been happening before then and after then. They signed a covenant, an agreement, and on this paper, Daryl is signing an apology for his disrespect of the police officer, which took a long time to get to that. And the activists weren't happy. And Sheriff Reynolds is signing an agreement that every single police officer in Porter County, Indiana, will undergo anti-bias training. The FOP was not happy about that. But actually, it was like enlightened self-interest. You know, if you know your own biases and you're approaching a car and you know what, you can figure out sooner. Anyone who knew Daryl knew he wasn't a drug dealer. It doesn't take very long to figure out what kind of person Daryl is. Okay, Daryl is not a thug, which is what a lot of the social media was saying about him. He's not. He's not that. We all know him. We all know who Daryl is. Okay, but you know, if you don't have any kind of anti-bias, you know, radar, then you're going to jump to a whole bunch of conclusions about what you think you're seeing, the image that's in front of you of what you think you're seeing. And so every police officer in Portland County, this was an amazing kind of creatively disruptive pattern that made nobody happy. Yeah, I think so. I think so. This really did turn out very good, and it continues to go well there. And sometimes it takes those of us who are kind of like outsiders to communities. You're an outsider to the prison community. You know, it takes the outsider. John Caputo, who is a theologian, philosopher that I love, Jack Caputo, he says it takes the outsider to tell the truth on the same. So it's the outsider who sees things that the insiders never even see or note or notice. And I was an outsider to Valparaiso, and Heath Carter is an outsider to Valparaiso as well. And so here we are, two outsiders, and it was just like really obvious that this thing can be solved. And I think that's how Mark's gospel ends. I love the way Mark's gospel ends. So the main character is, of course, Jesus Christ. The key figures are insiders and outsiders. The insiders never get it. It's the outsiders that get it, whether they're demonic or other sorts of outsiders. And I love the very end of the gospel, which ends on a cross. The whole gospel is rushing to try to get to a cross. I mean, it's just as fast as it can, immediately and to get to the cross. And at the cross, of course, and in the ending of John's gospel, there's no Mark's gospel, there's no neat bow that ties all the pieces. It is a mess at the end, okay? But at the end, there's one thing I really like. The temple, the curtain is torn in two, which I think from top to bottom, which I think is really interesting. That's really, really talking about paradoxes and stuff like that. That's really, and then in the next verse, there was a man who stood nearby opposite of Jesus. And actually the word para is the prefix here as well. Para. Yeah, so he stood opposite against Jesus. Isn't that an interesting kind of phrase? Opposite against Jesus. And he is the one, the outsider, the centurion, the paid mercenary, the hated, vilified one, the agent of imperial Rome, the colonializer. Okay, I like post-colonial theology. This guy's not my favorite. And this guy is the one who says, truly, this man was God's son. So I want to thank you for all that you do, day in, day out, as you rise and as you work and in all sorts of situations and settings to point people to God's Son, to the one on the cross, the one who repairs and heals the breach, the one that brings the pieces back together. And I want to thank you also for the creative disruption, the work of creative disruption that you do. I close with this. These are very familiar words. This is the Chartres Cathedral. It was begun in 1045 and it was ended in 1120. Not a single worker who started in the construction of the cathedral was there when the cathedral construction ended. The work, Irv, you and I talked about this, the work we are involved in started before we got there, and it's going to end long after we are gone. If you think you matter that much, Irv and I were just talking about that, just die. It'd be like earth to earth and ashes to ashes and dust to dust over you one day. And coffee and cake at the reception for your replacement. And that's a good thing. John who? Nunes what? That's a good thing. So closing with Niebuhr, nothing worth doing is completed in our lifetime. These are the paradoxes, more paradoxes. Therefore we are saved by hope. Nothing true or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history. Isn't that true? Therefore we are saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous we think it is, can be accomplished alone. Imago relationis. Therefore we are saved by love. Thank you.